Jason Abraham, the Shadow Teacher. And first let me say this. When I'm making these videos and I'm talking about spirituality, this is just my perspective. I'm not telling you what to believe or how to live. That's the mainstream media and the government's job, evidently, these days. But what I am offering is my personal perspective. And that perspective is based off of someone who is living an examined life and through the study of perspectives of others who I value, other perspectives that are out there on these topics of spirituality and everything I share on this channel. So that being said, today's video is about Christ consciousness and the ego, the relationship between the divine self and the finite self. I am not a religious person. I find religion as something that tells people, again, what to think. And I am more interested in how to think and finding the truth as opposed to just taking someone else's word for it. I find religion and spirituality to be two very different pathways. Sometimes they can converge, but I find whenever someone is dogmatic and tells you this is the way it is, then you're always going to find a contradiction there. So today I'm not telling you this is the way it is, I'm just telling you my experience. So Christ consciousness, I look at that as the divinity within me. I believe that God is not something that's separate, but God is in me. God is in this tree behind me. God is in the birds. And there is a higher form of consciousness that animates everything in the universe. And this idea of death and rebirth, I believe that that's not just something that happens once, but that's an ongoing process. We have many cycles of death and rebirth of our consciousness in this body, and then we have something as we go on to the realm beyond, which I've been there before, but not in this particular vessel. So Christ consciousness, when we build that relationship with Christ, our ego does not completely go away. In fact, we very much need our ego to be in this body. If we don't have our ego, we're not going to have the fortitude to move forward and to do anything significant in this life. That desire to be important, that desire to have purpose, that comes from our ego. And if we don't have that, we're just going to be taking on whatever the collective consciousness, the culture at hand tells us what we should be and what we should do. So in fact, it is our ego that has a very positive role in the spiritual rebirth and evolution. What I find, though, is when we are born again, when the living God starts to wake up within us, our ego starts to realize its role. Our ego takes a back seat and lets that higher consciousness be in the driver's seat. The ego always wants to be in the driver's seat, but once it starts to realize, wow, there is something bigger out there, and that greater spirit loves me and values me and has something very special for me in this life, then the ego takes a step back or can choose to take a step back. So I want to talk a little bit kind of what Christ consciousness looks like. When somebody starts to embody the Christ consciousness, what qualities do they take on? So simply, when someone is embodying Christ consciousness and says yes to this higher spirit, they are committed to doing the right thing, living in congruence and integrity with a higher spiritual power. That means standing against deception, manipulation, injustice, standing up to protect those who are being violated by the forces of evil, by anti-life forces, standing up to nurture those who need love, who need care, offering love and support to the world, being a good steward of nature, of the environment, not living in a wasteful, excessive manner. And at the same time, when we're loving, supporting, and protecting others, we're also not violating their opportunity for Christ to awaken within them. We're not going to go off and be their hero and their savior. We're simply offering the appropriate support and protection when it's needed. What does this not look like? So the path that is not Christ consciousness is a path that values itself from how many likes and followers it has on a social media platform. It is not about being perceived as being a good person or a righteous person, being perceived and celebrated as a good person by the world. It is not one that seeks external validation in any way. In fact, the Christ consciousness a lot of times is going to be crucified by the world, just as Jesus Christ himself was. And it's going to be a path that is met sometimes of violent resistance by what the world says you should be. So if the Christ consciousness is not alive in you, then most people are just going to collapse and not going to have the will to stand up when the world tells you to do something that you really don't want to do, or to do something that you know is not right. But when the Christ consciousness is alive, then you live without fear. You live without fear controlling you, and there's a peace that is in your heart that carries you forward, where you're able to stand up for what is right and do what is right, even when it's not the popular thing to do. It's a guiding light that co-creates with the ego. It finds what you're good at and basically pushes you forward on your path, where you're using your greatest skills and your talents as part of a greater good for the life process. I would not have the strength and the courage to make these videos the way I do if something bigger was not pushing me forward. And I'm saying yes to it. That's why these things come out the way that I present them. But it goes back again to being in the world, but not of the world. And the Christ consciousness, again, is going to show up in you very differently than it shows up in me. Everyone has their own gifts. Everyone's ego is different. And then when we co-create in our own special way, we make a great symphony. We make a great harmony. And we celebrate the living God in us and around us. I'm going to make a few more videos on Christ consciousness again, because just more awareness of it is coming into my understanding. But for those of you on this path of ascension, path of awakening, hope this supports you, and I will see you on the other side. Class dismissed.